I'm not just the president of the Global Cyber Alliance. I'm also a client of the GCA Cybersecurity Toolkit for elections. And that's because I'm an elected representative in the tiny little city of Falls Church, Virginia, which has about 15,000 people. I am on the school board. I was the vice chair for a couple of years. And I'm actually up for re-election this year. In the fall, there are 4 people running for 3 seats. And so I was doing a little research on the trip up here about the elections office, because I actually know the registrar of elections for the city of Falls Church. He's a personal friend of mine. And I know his deputy. Her daughter goes to school with my kids. So I wanted to find out, how many people do you have? Well, we have 1.5 people, because she's actually half-time. And this is a city. It's a very fairly well-off city, right? It's in the center of the Beltway. Great people, but there's a person and a half with absolutely no cybersecurity expertise responsible for running elections in a town that's only got about 15,000 people, and so 10 votes plus or minus makes a really significant difference, right? And that's the sort of people we were thinking about in working with the Center for Internet Security to develop the Cybersecurity Toolkit for elections. There are elections bodies that are very, very big around the country that have a more substantial amount of resources. And then there's a small 1.5 person shop in the Washington, D.C. area of Virginia that asked for an additional half a person to help run elections, and the city council said, no, we don't have the money, right? They're not people that are thinking, how are we going to spend our next $500,000 on election security? They're thinking about, with the limited resources I've got and the limited amount of people I got, what's the very best job I can do to defend democracy? And that's the goal behind the Cybersecurity Toolkit for elections, to give elections bodies, both in the US and increasingly around the world, an opportunity to make their elections as secure as they can be by doing basic hygiene measures without having to spend money for the tools. Does that mean it doesn't take resources? No, it does take resources. It takes people. You have to do these things. But it's one way to let them be more effective, to have a framework, and to supplement the great work that they're already doing but don't have enough resources to do already. So we're going to start the session today with a video message from one of our founders, the District Attorney of Manhattan, Cyrus Vance, Jr. Please.
Hi, this is Cy Vance. I want to congratulate Global Cyber Alliance and the Center for Internet Security on today's launch of the GCA Cybersecurity Toolkit for elections. When I co-founded GCA in 2015 with the Center for Internet Security and the City of London Police, our goal was to reduce the risk of cyber threats across borders and across sectors. In just a few years, GCA has grown to over 250 partners across 18 sectors and 29 countries. Most importantly, GCA has assisted individuals and entities by creating valuable tools to protect themselves from malware, phishing, and ransomware attacks. GCA's Cybersecurity Small Business Toolkit, for example, was an important step in making sure that everyone is able to reduce their vulnerabilities from these troubling threats, regardless of resources. I'm proud that the GCA Cybersecurity Toolkit for elections will play an important part in protecting our democracy. As we all have learned, cyber threats to our elections come from around the world, and they have a profound impact on our cherished right to select our local, state, and national leaders. And just like the Small Business Toolkit, the Elections Toolkit is designed to empower election agencies of all sizes, regardless of resources or the size of their jurisdiction. I commend GCA and the Center for Internet Security for their work, and thank the Craig Newmark Philanthropies Foundation for its support to make this important initiative happen. All the best to you. Thank you, and congratulations.
Thank you, Cy. Thank you, Ken. So we're going to open up with a panel, and our moderator is Kim Zetter. I think if you've been working in this space for any amount of time, you know Kim. This is it's a fairly novel and developing space. Kim is one of the deans of cybersecurity reporting, and wrote the first election security article I think I ever heard of back in 2003. So she was well in advance of the curve. The other person on our fireside chat / panel is Craig Newmark. Craig Newmark, I think, is probably known to most of you. He was the founder of Craigslist and now spends most of his time figuring out how to make the world a better place and donate his money in effective ways to improve, among other things, the effective exercise of democracy, both in terms of securing elections and in making journalism better, fairer, and more open to everyone. So Craig and Kim, if you could come up, we'll do our fireside chat.
So if you don't mind, I will stand here. Maybe I'll turn a little here. So thanks for the introduction, Phil. As you said, I've been covering cybersecurity, election security since 2003, and it's taken this long to get toolkits like this, to get the attention of Washington, to get the attention of voting machine vendors and election officials. And one of the problems that they've had for a long time is exactly what you're describing, is the lack of personnel and the lack of resources. And so a toolkit like this is great for those small offices. I'm using this one, but I actually have a microphone, sorry. Are those small offices that don't really have the knowledge or the resources. So I think I wanted to start with basically just, for those who haven't actually looked at the toolkit yet, if you could give us sort of an overview briefly of what it includes and the design of it. Because what I found interesting was that you start with, you have steps. And you start with the first step of, anyone who works in cybersecurity knows one of the basic problems that you have quite often is that the system administrator doesn't actually even know what they have on the network. You don't know what equipment you have, and therefore you can't even begin to secure it. So why don't you walk us through briefly what are you offering in the toolkit?
Happy to, Kim. So I'm going to do this very briefly because we're actually going to get a demo of the toolkit from Adnan Baykal later. But we're a deep believer in GCA that we shouldn't invent anything that's already been done. We steal to the greatest extent we can when somebody else has done the work. And in this case, an organization had done almost all of the work, and that's the Center for Internet Security. So the Center for Internet Security, years ago, developed a series of critical controls, or the list, the list of the top controls that everyone ought to implement. And we took, first for the small business toolkit, the top 10 of those controls that are focused on sort of basic hygiene, the things that scalable, the things that everybody ought to do to make their networks more secure. And then we took that work and took the work that the CIS had also done through the election infrastructure, ISAC, and otherwise, in terms of advising elections bodies on things that they ought to do. And our goal, working with CIS, was to build a free toolkit, something that took the guidance that had already been prepared and went a step farther. So the guidance is there, but it's divided into 9, in this case, relatively easy to understand. We call them toolboxes. And then in each toolbox, there's a series of step-by-step instructions, and not just the guidance, but the actual tools you can use to implement the guidance. So, for example, as you were saying, Kim, something that nobody does well is inventory, a hardware inventory or software inventory. You can go to any big company in the United States, and they'll tell you they've got a CMDB, a configuration management database. Chances are it's years old, out of date, and not particularly accurate. And the smaller you get in organizations, the worse it's going to be. So this is really, really important. You can't patch your systems, you can't lock them down unless you know what's there, unless you know what's connected to your network and what software it's running. So that's the first toolbox, and then you go through a series of 8 other toolboxes to do a bunch of, I'd like to say simple things, because they kind of are simple things, but in practice they can be very, very hard to do and resource intensive, and gives an organization the tools that they would want to use to make those things possible.
And so how did this partnership come about? I mean, so it's not a natural partnership, I think, Craig Newmark in elections. So how did you get interested in this, Craig, and how did this come about in terms of your support of the toolkit?
Well, I'm involved in a number of efforts involved in election security, and I'm involved in a number of efforts involving cybersecurity. The deal is that I do see that there is interference in our elections for some years from bad actors, both foreign and domestic. And I figure it's incumbent upon anyone who has the opportunity and the means to help out in this area. This in part stems from conversations over years. I support a bunch of veterans groups, and they tell me that they're pretty happy that I never had to go through boot camp because nerd, but they're very happy that I'm dealing with areas of information warfare, cybersecurity. They say that's my fight because nerd. So I'm involved in a number of efforts already, like right now we're in the middle of a training program, the theme of which is to train 100 women in 100 days for cybersecurity careers. Another effort for this year is to train 300 vets for cybersecurity careers. So all this seems a natural fit. My deal is that where I should be spending my time is helping professionals do what they can do well and build more professionals, particularly in cybersecurity, where there's a severe skills shortage. So supporting people doing cybersecurity work, supporting the people figuring out what's going on with election interference, and helping people involved in the areas where those intersect. Also, in Phil's honor, I will let people know that I should have been a member of the Hair Club for Men, but passed.
So there have been a number of efforts already going into election security since 2016, and we've got Department of Homeland Security is doing risk assessments, vulnerability assessments for local election offices. We've got things like the Belfer Center, which has done tabletop exercises for election officials to prepare them for responding to events. And we've got the list from the Center for Internet Security. So what is different about the toolkit? I mean, what are you offering that isn't being offered by other resources?
So I'd say what we're doing is supplementary to all of those efforts. Just as an intro, one might ask, why are we at the Sir Francis Tavern? I don't know if you know the history of this place, but George Washington commanded the Revolutionary Wars from here for a while. And there were federal offices here, and I believe some of the negotiations with the British about a peace treaty were held here. So this is a center the center of our country's birth, not about just talking, but about doing. And that's what the toolkit is. The resources you mentioned are all great. So the playbooks from both CIS and the Belfer Center, and the exercises from Belfer, and the other work that is being done, like the work that's going to be done by the Democracy Project, Defending Democracy Project, also an extension of the Belfer Center going forward to help campaigns. That's all good stuff. What we've done is we tried to add to that corpus of capability. We think guidance is great, but guidance can be really, really tough to consume, especially for that election office that has a person and a half. So what we've tried to do is, like with the Small Business Toolkit, take the good guidance that is out there and map it to the tools that you would use to implement the guidance. So you need to do an inventory? Here, yes, you do. Here's a free tool you can use to do an inventory. You need to lock down your systems. Here is an AV tool and a protective DNS tool. I'm happy to get into those if anybody wants to talk. Things that you can use to defend yourself. Here's how to turn on auto-updating, specific instructions about how to make your systems up to date automatically without further intervention. And I will tell you, it's an initial effort. It's a first step. But it's out there, it's available, and it's going to get better and better as I like to say, we're building the toolkits not for, they're cookbooks not for Gordon Ramsay, right? They're cookbooks for the people that want to try out for MasterChef Junior, but don't have the time or the energy because they're doing other things. So that's what the toolkit is and why it's different from those other efforts.
So you mentioned free tools in this toolkit. Did you find it frustrating when you were trying to put together multiple toolkits for let's say, products that you wanted that are maybe better than free tools? I mean, I guess from the perspective of someone looking at this and seeing, maybe doesn't know the distinction between commercial toolkits and freely available, were you frustrated in the selection that you had, or are you satisfied that these free tools are enough and sufficient?
Well, I wouldn't say that one never reaches the question, is it enough in cybersecurity? It's all about risk management. We've taken what we believe are a series of best-of-breed free tools and assembled them for people to use. You can always get, is it the Geico ad? You can get more, right, if you pay more. Some of these, like in one case, the tool is free, but if you're willing to cut a check, then you can get additional automation features. But often the very, very best in breed stuff isn't free. But we've assembled a bunch of things that are usable, and some of them, like open source tools like Nmap and Nessus, are pretty much state-of-the-art capabilities. You'll get commercial companies that'll add to that and integrate them and make it better, but that wasn't our goal here. So I wasn't ever frustrated. I do think that if we get success in the toolkit, we're going to have additional companies wanting to lean forward to offer really good free tools because they want to be in the toolkit and they want to get their products out there. And that's a good thing. It happened already with the Cybersecurity Toolkit for Small Business, where several companies decided to offer a free DMARC-related service because they wanted to be in the toolkit. And not saying that everyone should immediately start using our toolkit all the time, please do, but I'm not saying that. I just say that the more people that use it, the more market influence it'll have, and then the more effective it'll be at driving good behavior.
Well, so when we go back to the elections office, a small elections office, and there are many of them, and they're not just the offices that have 1.5 people. There are many large cities that have really small elections office, and they often won't have them full time. They'll bring them on just for elections, and very seldom do they have someone who's actually specializing in security. So when you're offering free tools, I mean, you're talking about Nmap. That's not a newbie's tool. So how are you? I mean, just making the tools available, it doesn't help if the people on staff or not on staff or are brought in don't understand how to use them. How are you solving that gap, or is there any way that you're solving it?
Well, there are things that and I think things that other people are doing as well. We've included video guidance in the toolkit, so it's designed to be more consumable. There's a range of tools in the toolkit, some of which require more capability and some of which require less capability. Yes, Nmap and Nessus are not, they're not like, running Windows Bob. They're a little bit more of a challenge. But they're ones that are more like Windows Bob or Windows 98 that are sort of plug and play. So we're going to also, besides offering that range of tools, we put the functionality into the toolkit so that users can rate tools.
I'm finding that a lot of people, elections offices or business or anywhere, a lot of folks are just intimidated by the whole notion of security. With a painless introduction, if they're not intimidated, then they can do basic things like even updating their desktop operating system can do some good. And sometimes they can introduce, during election period, they can introduce an air gap between their desktop and the internet just by pulling the cable. A lot of things are simple. A lot of things don't need to be as intimidating as they sound. And so toolkits like this are a start, at which point, well, once the elections official has some of the vocabulary, then possibly they could take some new steps. I'd like to add, given the historic nature of Francis Tavern, I grew up not far away from here in Morristown, New Jersey, where Washington spent a couple winters at just Jacob Ford Mansion, which was the actual capital of the Revolution.
I just have a couple more questions, and then we can get into digging more deeply into the toolkit. This appears to be focused primarily on U.S. elections, or at least the way it's displayed. Do you have plans for reaching out through other countries and other elections after this, making other tools available?
Absolutely. So we've been in consultations with a number of other countries about what we're doing in both small business and elections, including the Canadians and the Australians. Our right now, the main limitation on the toolkit is it is only in English. But that will change. Both the Small Business Toolkit and the Elections Toolkit will be translated into additional languages going forward. And most of the tools in the toolkit, although you're correct, absolutely, Kim, this is focused on a U.S. elections audience for this version, but most of the things in the toolkit are usable around the world. And so those elections bodies would be free to use the capabilities. Now, for example, there are Albert sensors in which some of you have probably not heard of. In fact, most of you may not have heard of Albert sensors. But it's a capability that's really only available to state and local government agencies in the U.S. So those things are there. But in the future, as we get additional languages, there may be a special tool that's only available in Germany for elections bodies. And the wonderful way about how we've structured this is we can extend the toolkit and make a special version available to that group. It's a nice approach that will allow you to present the set of tools that are usable for that audience, specifically to that audience, with the context that they will understand. And that's the goal.
You had talked about, when we were talking about this prior, that you really wanted to build up a community around this, that you were hoping to have forums, and I suppose that would also help with the usability, where people can offer advice and assistance. But what are you hoping to have around that in terms of community building, and how are you doing outreach for that?
Well, Craig could probably talk much more effectively about the importance of online community building than I could, but I'll start. One of the most important things that can happen with these sorts of capabilities is building a set of relationships for people to talk. With the Small Business Toolkit, it's about building a bunch of small business owners that can support each other with some mix. There's actually a head start in the elections community, right? Because there are organizations like the Elections Infrastructure ISAC that is a part of the Center for Internet Security. But what our plan is to build up a way for elections organizations that are using the toolkit or doing security and using parts or none of the toolkit to communicate with each other and give each other support, much more than we could. It's sort of the idea behind Reddit and, to be frank, Twitter and almost all social networking is all of us is smarter than any one of us. And so we haven't yet in the toolkit, but the plan is to build out a capability with our partners like CIS to make all of us available to answer the questions of any of us on the toolkit.
Well, what I try to do is to find people working in cybersecurity or related fields, even including disinformation, and then try to get people to talk to each other. As part of my effort to find people doing really good work, well, part of that's helping fund them, and part of the funding issue is to get people just to talk with each other. I remind people that helping preserve the vote and actually voting, those are acts where you actually defend the country. I tell them I take it personally. I tell them to take it seriously, because all I know how to do is to write checks and then nudge people in a good direction. And that's maybe the beginning of something that helps. It's pretty obvious that I lack the kind of charisma to be very persuasive. So again, the theme is to help fund people and then to push people in the right direction. Yeah, sometimes just putting your money where your mouth is enough for something to happen. We talk like that in New Jersey.
The final question that I had was in terms of outreach, because this isn't an election community, and cybersecurity isn't an election community. So how are you getting the word out to those small election offices and the people who are actually making decisions and can implement this? How are they going to learn about the toolkit and know how to use it? So
the real truth of the answer is shoe leather. I think you have to go out and talk to groups of people that are doing the work. As I said, we've got a head start because CIS was GCA's partner in getting this done, and it has brought these election groups together through the Election Infrastructure ISAC. But I'm talking on a panel at the EAC, the Election Assistance Commission, on Thursday of this week. We've got conversations set up with the National Association of Secretaries of State and other bodies, and we've already done a webinar on the toolkit for the National Governors Association. So we're going to use any and every tool available at our disposal, down to probably showing up and trying to do some individualized training and taking certain people through the toolkit in places that we can to sort of start to get the traction and build word of mouth. We're just a little old nonprofit, and we do what we can. I will tell you that being funded by someone like Craig Newmark Philanthropies makes a huge difference too, because people say, oh, Craig, I know of Craigslist, I've heard of Craig Newmark, that he sees value in this. That's an important piece of evidence as well.
Anything to add, any of it?
Well, basically, again, given the tremendous lack of charisma that I have, the idea is just to keep standing up for issues like this wherever I can in social media, just short of spamming people, but just to say it and to say it again, to get my comms and PR people to repeat the message towards helping create a new normal. This has been going on for years in different ways, working with cops and others, and even now figuring out how I can make available as needed the video footage from outside my place when it's needed while respecting due process. I'm in over my head, but nerds got to do what a nerd's got to do.
All right, thank you both. Please join me in thanking the two panelists.
So we've got our next panel now on threat and action. So I'd like to invite up Megan Stifel, who is going to moderate the panel, and she'll introduce the panelists.
I'm not one for standing behind podiums, so I think I'm going to join everyone on the couch, and we'll go boy, girl, boy, girl. So thanks everyone for coming this afternoon. Hopefully this is working, and you all can hear me. Let me know if that changes. I'm delighted to have a panel of such esteemed colleagues here with me, and I'm going to start from my far right and move towards myself. As Phil said, my name is Megan Stifel. I'm the Senior Policy Counsel at the Global Cyber Alliance. Recently joined them about 8 weeks ago. Who's counting? So I'm delighted to have with us the President and CEO of the Center for Internet Security, Mr. John Gilligan. John previously served as Chairman of the Board of CIS and was a member of the Board of Directors for a number of years, and was previously the Chief Information Officer for both the Air Force and the Department of Energy, but not at the same time. He was also a member of the Senior Executive Service within the government, and I think actually all of us have that in common, which is to say that by either working for an FFRDC or having spent a lot of time in governments, that's, I think, one of our bonds here. Lisa Past is currently the Next Generation Fellow at the McCain Institute at Arizona State University. She previously served as the Chief Research Officer for the Estonian Information Authority. I think I got that mostly right? Yeah. Yes. Lisa is a native Estonian, and we're delighted to have her participate and share some of her experience from having been here watching things overseas, but also having lived in Estonia for most of her life, I believe. Mark Schneider, to my immediate right, is at MITRE Corporation, which is a federally funded research and development corporation. Did I get that right? FFRDC? Yes, yes. 7, I thought it was 6. Okay.
It's now 7.
Mark has spent most of his time, most recently, on election security, and so we're going to have a conversation around two important aspects of the current situation that we find ourselves in. The first is sort of level setting on the threat to democracies and the threat to election security, largely to try to bring down the hype a bit and speak about facts, what's possible and what's not possible, and making sure that we are keeping consistent with the facts on the ground. The second is to talk about action, and that's what the toolkit is about, which is to say, knowing what we know about the tactics, techniques, and procedures of various foreign powers and criminal groups, how can we use known tools, largely embodied in the Center for Internet Security's critical controls and in the handbook that was produced around the election on election security, to best mitigate and manage threats to election security. So I mentioned that Lisa is originally from Estonia, and so we know, Lisa, one of your neighboring countries has been involved in a variety of tactics, techniques, and procedures to ultimately undermine the credibility of the democracy, largely, I think is the biggest one to try and, is their primary objective. But I think it's important to remember here that there are two types of activities ongoing. One is a set of information operations tactics. The second is our technical tools. And obviously, the election security toolkit is focused on the latter of those. Nonetheless, I think it's important to spend a few minutes talking about the purposes to which Russia and other foreign powers are using their different capabilities, and then we'll move into, so we're going to talk about who is doing this, why they're doing this, how they're doing it, and then talk about how it is that we can best mitigate those TTPs. So Lisa, I'll kick it over to you.
Thank you. This very much is in the spirit of a nerd's gotta do what a nerd's gotta do. I got into election security in Estonia because our election managers, just like those everywhere around the world, were very good at securing their own networks and connections and systems, which is great, but it was 2017 outside. So I went in and said things like, well, comprehensive risk management, and there's all these other things happening. And the truth of the matter is, here and everywhere around the world, that the election managers, election management bodies, the good and capable ones, can take care of the very core functioning of voting. So the systems, connections, computers involved in how a citizen's vote is cast. And then everyone else has to step in, be it non-governmental or cybersecurity agencies of the government, many of whom have been mentioned. The DHS does a lot in this country as well to help with the rest. So what you're securing, first of all, is the very core of voting, but then that's surrounded of the rest of election technology, be it digital voter lists, be it candidate databases, be it how you publish your results. Most famous of a breach of that being 2014 in Ukraine, where the website of the Central Elections Commission of Ukraine was defaced a couple minutes before polls were closing and showed a right extreme candidate winning at something like 37%. He actually came in 11th at 0.7%, which is slightly less convincing. But that really shows how integrated the adversarial strategy is, going to the most obvious attacker, the one that every single one of the three-letter agency of this country has attributed attacks on elections to. The two players we really talk about are the hacker groupings, most commonly known as APT 28 and 29. It's the bear ones. So that's those connected with the foreign intelligence agencies of the Russian Federation. APT 28 with the GRU, the foreign military intelligence. APT 29 is believed to be the civilian side of foreign intelligence. And for them, everything is an attack surface. So they're really throwing spaghetti at the wall and seeing what sticks. And the wall starts with the voting, with the election technology, carries on with the facilitators of elections, so vendors, other government digital services, everything that your elections and the legitimacy of your democracy can rely on, and ends in this highly integrated frame of information operations. Let's call it that. That very good child has many names. Since in the end, the adversarial objective and their strategic or national interest look is not to necessarily advance any particular party or candidate or breach any or compromise any particular system, but to rather sow doubt and confusion, to delegitimize the Western way of running our liberal representative democracies, which makes defense hard. That's why defending merely your systems and networks is not enough, since in this delegitimizing mindset, everything and anything is fair game and everything and anything is an attack surface. And what we've seen, given that the international response has mostly been naming and shaming, which is highly ineffective if the perpetrator doesn't really get shamed but rather gloats, is that other players, the obvious ones being Iran, North Korea, and China to a degree, are learning from the Russian playbook. That's the bad news. I promised I'll get to the good news. The good news is that the attacks are quite formulaic. They're out of the attacks that we talk about as the election hacks, as well as many of the attacks against critical infrastructure, in particular in Ukraine, but also other parts of the world, go exactly the way John Podesta's email got hacked, which is socially engineered spear phishing, followed by malware being downloaded, followed by an attacker laying low, so working hard to avoid detection, preferring legitimate network management tools over more aggressive ways of gaining access. So being patient, being slow, being opportunistic, and being reactive. And we know that. We know that of the attackers. So I think Russia is a lot more predictable than is believed to be. I think the global cybersecurity community has done itself a disservice by over-mystifying Russia as this unpredictable player, whereas all Russia is doing is throwing all the spaghetti they have at all the walls there are, and it's our job to make the walls as non-stick as possible, having beaten that metaphor to death now. And so the good news is that this can actually be solved for. The good news is that now we can break down the comprehensive risk management that's needed into bits and pieces. And again, working from the very center, this is where approaches such as this toolkit come in. There's a number of documents that Kim Zetter already mentioned that lay out the principles of how technology should be introduced to make sure that we have free, fair, open elections based on a secret ballot. But really, when it comes down to that person that have not just in a place in Virginia and New Jersey, but also most national election offices in Europe, it's this sort of operational guidance that often starts with how you give advice to your mom, take a chair, sit down, push the on button. That's actually been sorely missing. And that's why I'm so incredibly hopeful for the work that's being done here, in that it operationalizes.
Thank you. So we know we've been talking about primarily one foreign power, the Russian Federation. We know that their intentions are clear, right? Their goal is to sow doubt in the democratic process, in the election process by which we run our democracy. We know that their targets are known. Lisa mentioned a few of them. I wanted to quickly turn to Mark briefly to talk a little bit about sort of capabilities and some of the TTPs that we often see, to say a little bit about, again, the capabilities are known as well. So we're seeing, as Lisa said, a set of consistent practices, which then allows us to identify defenses to deploy, which allows us to secure and maintain and build confidence in the election system. So Mark, you're coming from MITRE. You've spent a lot of time on election security and looking at, through the MITRE attack framework, the capabilities of a variety of foreign powers and other actors. I wondered if you could spend a few minutes talking a little bit about what you've seen from your vantage point at MITRE, and then perhaps a little bit around other threat actors that we may see in this space, whether we think they're likely to participate, and how some of the tools that we have available are also useful to combat those types of threats.
Sure. So first I'll explain what attack is. So MITRE has a framework called the Adversarial Tactics, Techniques, and Common Knowledge, which is a system for organizing how adversarial actors behave in our networks. on our computer systems. And attack is really useful because you can align and see in the attack what they call the matrix, how these different techniques are used to accomplish different tactics. And if you want to see, for example, APT28 and what their common tactics are for various different techniques, you can look that up in the APT28 group. So this is all focused on cyber threats, tactics, techniques, and common knowledge. When we get into elections, not only do we have these cyber techniques, there's other disinformation techniques that are used and whatnot. So at MITRE, one of the things we've been looking at is sort of this combined framework that takes information operations, as my colleague mentioned, and these cyber technical threats, and looks at the landscape as a whole. And in this context, you have to understand is just like throwing spaghetti at a wall to see what sticks, the adversary will use whatever means needed to achieve their goals. If that's a disinformation campaign, they'll use that. If it's a cyber attack, they'll use that, but more likely it's going to be some combination of both. And so this is one of the places where I think the toolkit is actually very useful, is addressing these common tactics and techniques. You know, it's a term used frequently in the field, cyber hygiene. And if you go to a doctor and the doctor doesn't wash their hands between patients, they could have the fanciest laser scalpel in the world. I will not let them operate on me. Okay, the toolkit offers those basic cyber hygiene tools that you need to have in place to fight almost all of those common techniques. So it's washing your hands, the cyber equivalent of washing your hands, of making sure you sterilize your tools, and et cetera, et cetera. And I think one of the really nice things is that, as I believe Phil said earlier, there's a path, and the toolkit leads you through this to understand how you deploy these things, how you can put basic tools and techniques in place to minimize or mitigate the threats posed by our adversaries. Again, we don't expect, the smallest jurisdictions to be doing the same as a very large, well-funded jurisdiction, but washing your hands goes an awfully long way to keeping you healthy, and making sure that everybody's washing their hands, everybody's using good cyber hygiene goes an awfully far way to making sure that our systems are secure from a technical perspective.
Great, thank you. So we've, excuse me, set a level a little bit with who we're talking about, what their tactics, techniques, and procedures are, and the tools that are available briefly. But I think, John, I'm hoping that you can share with us, as one of the principal authors of the handbook for election security that CIS put together published last year, I should say. If you could speak a little bit about how that handbook came together, and if there are, particularly to Mark's point about discrete cyber hygiene pieces. We'll see a demo of the toolkit in a few minutes here. It has 9 toolboxes in it, but if there are particular, would you say start with the beginning, or are there highlights that you would like to draw out from the toolkit if one jurisdiction were primarily looking to start at the bare bottom?
Sure, thank you. Before I get into the handbook and the toolkit, one of the things that I'd like to share is, so I have a fairly long-standing background in cybersecurity. My elections background is probably less than 2 years. I recall vividly being in a meeting that was at the Center for Internet Security. We had a set of elections officials. We had state officials, local officials, we had secretaries of state, we had Department of Homeland Security, and the discussion was sort of to look back at what happened in 2016. And through this discussion, it was very interesting. This was my first entree into elections. The elections officials kept repeating, no votes were changed. No votes were changed. That is, they were shocked that a year after the 2016 election, there was such anxiety about what happened. And of course, that's just continued over the last 2 years, but no votes were changed. Today, if you were to approach an elections official, they understand it. That was the big aha, is that you don't have to change votes to accomplish your objectives. And I think, as Lisa well pointed out, in many cases, the objective is really to undermine our democracy and our confidence in democracy. And so in the cyber realm, for the very small amount of energy that was expended, because, as was mentioned, they didn't do anything really sophisticated. Primarily, they went off after voter registration systems. Now, what's a voter registration system? It's a system that collects those who are registered to vote. That information, in general, is publicly available. In many states, they sell it, so you can get access to it, you can buy it. But the fact that there was a tax against the voter registration system gave a signal that there were, in this case, foreign entities that were interested in upsetting our elections process, and potentially you could do some damage. The damage was very quickly remediated. And so I think the big aha was that, as Lisa pointed out, in the past, in the United States, we have spent a lot of energy trying to protect what I would call vote capture, which is the potential system that would actually capture your vote, and the vote tabulation, which will take all of the votes, tabulate them, and produce the results. We have very specific standards, we have certification regimes, et cetera. Voter registration was not subject to those same types of regimes. Why? The view was, you can't change any votes with a voter registration system. The worst you can do is cause lines at the polls or require somebody to file a provisional ballot. But in now 3 years post 2016, the amount of energy that has been expended on the Russian attack gives an indication, and most of the people in the public who don't understand, as I do, the different elements of the voting system, their view is our fundamental democracy has been undermined by Russia, what they've tried to do, and actually it's been very effective. It's been amplified by, our systems in the United States. So when we in CIS looked at that, we said, well, wait a minute, there is very well-defined standards for vote capture and vote tally, but there's nothing for the other elements of the voting systems, and that's why we produced this handbook of elections infrastructure security. And basically what we took was work that we had done previously. We tailored it and focused it on the elections infrastructure. We put it in the context of the various elements of the elections infrastructure, and then we identified these are the actions that you need to take. As was mentioned, many of these other systems are built on general purpose computers. And as a result, they have many of the same types of vulnerabilities. And therefore, as Phil mentioned earlier, a lot of these tools are fairly generally applicable. And so we produced the handbook. The tools are aligned with the handbook. The handbook identifies 88 best practices. It provides a fair bit of information to the elections organizations and their technical teams about which are the most important, how to assess what are the risks. What we say is anything that is what we call network connected is a significant risk. And the assumption is that if it is network connected in any way, connected to any network, it is likely connected to the internet and therefore can be exploited from a remote location. That therefore becomes the highest priority for focus. And so our handbook addresses that, and likewise the tools, and the intent is to focus the energies of the elections offices on those things that are the highest priority to reduce the risk.
Thank you. I don't know if either of you have anything to add to the conversation around tools, best practices and the deployment of best practices. When we were talking about getting ready for our discussion this afternoon, Mark and I and John and Lisa as well, were talking about defense in depth. So the need and both the toolbox and the elections security handbook that CIS put together, obviously this is a collective effort, don't just address the security of, for example, the voter registration databases. As John said, there are multiple elements of the architecture to correctly take and tally the vote that need to be secured. So I don't know if either of you, Lisa or Mark, wants to speak a little bit to.
Sure, I can start off with some of that. So one of the things to understand with security in general is you need to look at real-world threats and realistic risks. Frequently, people can think up scenarios whereby some obscure technical means people are able to mitigate a series of controls. But as my colleagues have said, that's typically not what's done. They use basic techniques over and over and over to get through. And so while some techniques may be stopped by some tools, by having layers, defense in depth, you can stop them at various different points in the defense strategy. So this is the overall concept of defense in depth. When you start to bring in, procedures and policies and handbooks, you start looking at not only a single cyber technical defense in depth, but combined depth in defense in depth. And so you have how do you prepare for when an incident like a voter registration database breach might occur? What's the response? What's the public statements? What's the procedures to recover from that breach are just as important as the tools and techniques used to defend. And I think, if I remember correctly, part of the toolkit talks about backup systems, backing up your systems. Well, how is that a defense? It's not a defense ahead of time. It's a recovery and restoration thing. And having all those different aspects covered, including after the fact that something has occurred, and putting that into the perspective as to what has occurred and the fact that we can recover from it is important. And I think using the real world risk analysis and threat-based scenarios is critical to understanding how we best defend our systems.
And let's really, face the ultimate truth of security, which is that no system's 100% secure 100% of the time. Anyone who claims it is either naive or criminally negligent or both. The only way a system's 100% secure is if it's powered down, unplugged, drowned at the bottom of the ocean and covered in cement, which is great for security, not so great for availability. It's quite suboptimal for the users, I've heard. So that's when you start to look at exactly sort of defending your own assets, defending your own technology, and changing the attacker's cost-benefit calculation of attacking you, with a full comprehension that given enough resources, anything could be breached. But you want to make sure that compromising you is more expensive than what can be gained. And it seems to be already, when we look at the midterms of last year, at the European Parliament elections of late May this year, and the 2 rounds of Ukrainian presidential elections, it was a lot calmer on the cybersecurity front than 2014 for the Ukrainians and 2016 for the US and Europe alike. So that again is an indication of possibly us moving in the right direction in terms of tipping the adversarial cost-benefit calculation. And we don't control the attacker, but we do control our actions. And the actions are step by step and quite granular in making their work harder and therefore not worth it.
I think if the message hasn't become quite clear, there are many known knowns in this space. We often like to get sort of sidetracked and overwhelmed by the known unknowns or the unknown unknowns. But I think the message that all of us are trying to convey is that there are known tactics and procedures, known capabilities to defend against them, and that collectively a collective effort should lead to greater confidence in the upcoming elections. So. Lisa, I wondered, you mentioned briefly the European parliamentary elections and your work a little bit overseas. I wondered if you wanted to spend a moment talking a little bit about the differences that we have here, and there's some discussion about moving towards paper ballots. For those of you who don't know, Estonians vote entirely, I believe.
As one option.
Online, if they so choose. That's quite a difference, and there are a number of reasons why there's a difference. Obviously, Estonia is a much smaller population. They have some of you may know that they suffered a fairly significant cyber event in 2007. Although I lived there in the late 90s, and I was impressed at that time how Estonia was. So the difference is, what do you see, Lisa, in how we're approaching things in this country versus in Europe?
So in 2007, I was a journalist in Estonia, and it's quite hard to put your newspaper out and send it to print when you're under intense cyber attack, and it's before you learn to segment your business system and your public-facing portal. It's run from the same server that's being intensely DDoSed. But we've learned from that. That was a great exercise for which Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin's not yet built the Estonian government. It's also, as Megan mentioned, at the time where, yes, internet banking was down for a couple hours at a time for a couple days in a row. I had lived about 10 miles up Broadway a couple years before. It took my checks 7 working days to clear. So not being able to do instantaneous bank transfer for a couple hours, for a couple days in a row was a wake-up call, but not really that big a deal. The way fundamentally the electoral systems differ, I think it's important to know, first of all, is the paper ballot. Estonia offers close to a dozen different ways of voting, some of them extremely exotic and not really widely used, such as if you're out on a ship, you can provisionally vote with a provisional ballot with a captain if it's a ship in international waters under Estonian flag. A, there's not a lot of those vessels. B, we also can vote electronically. I-voting happens during the provisional balloting period, and it relies on a very lively ecosystem, digital ecosystem. Most importantly, my Estonian government-issued ID carries with it a digital signature and a digital authentication, 2 separate keys that are legally equal to me presenting my ID in person and me signing in person. And that comes with government backing. About 6,000 different services rely on that digital ID. So it's one of 6,000 digital services. And that makes a huge difference. The lesson from there is really that your elections should not be more digital than the level of digitalization in the governance they support. I strongly recommend against experimenting with elections just because of how fundamental they are to the legitimacy of governance and to the legitimacy of how as societies we've chosen to live our lives. And the second big difference is the American belief in the free market and vendors, and in buying black box-like systems from the market, something that Kim spent a decade talking about, and fortunately people are increasingly listening to, specifically when it comes to voting machines. And that again is a balance in risk management. The European approach is we own the code, no one else gets the code, it's secure because it's only ours, which is great as long as things go right. But the moment there's a global vulnerability that you have no control over, you become slow at patching because it's only you and you're only your own priority customer, and governments are not the best developers necessarily. But on the other extreme is the US approach, where we go to a shelf and we take the most expensive box from the top shelf without a lot of transparency in the code, without legally being able to audit all parts of it necessarily, and without, we could hackathon anything we do. Legally, the US election organizers can't. So it's also this issue of how do we see our supply chain and how much control we want over that. That's very, very different. Having said that, the basic principles of good cyber hygiene are the same. Don't be John Podesta. Don't get spearfished and then have runner 3, 4, 5, 6 as your password across the platforms. That's generally good advice. Test and audit your technology as early as possible and as thoroughly as possible. In case you cannot do that before going live, which is the case if you're buying a boxed product, that's when you need to have risk-limiting audits to balance it. If the rest of your governance relies on paper, have your elections rely on paper as well. But also accept that in a more digitalized society, paper isn't there. Paper and pen is just another technology that's not 100% secure either.
So obviously, the Estonians have someone might say, a slightly less complicated system, as we have somewhere around 8,000, I believe, jurisdictions casting ballots in our national elections. John, you've been in very large organizations like the Air Force and working as the CIO for the Department of Energy. The contrast between managing a country of a population and their election count of 1.5 million people versus the size and scope of large enterprise networks such as DOE and the Air Force. When we sort of think about contrasting those large federal entities to state and locals, where do you see the most similarities, and particularly as it relates to how to, as we say in the toolkit, start with what you know, configure securely, control access, these types of tools. Is it a matter of running the checklist, or is it more a matter of, obviously we always talk about building a culture of security, but in terms of thinking about, for those who are sort of still scratching their heads saying, where do I begin? What advice would you give them?
Sure. The Air Force, so the Department of Defense is very different than the non-national security parts of government. As just a little vignette, when I was CIO, I used to interact with private sector CIOs, and I would make the comment that generally when I issued a policy, people followed it. And their response was, "You're kidding, really? As a CIO, they followed your policy?" Well, that's the culture in the military. The Department of Energy was very different. Let me contrast that with state and local governments. In the states, I mean, our democratic system has set up a highly distributed set of authorities and controls. And so at the state level, and it depends on the state, states are different. Some states have a little bit of control over the local elections jurisdictions, and some have virtually none. Yes, they legally have a little bit, but and they're highly independent. And as was mentioned, there's a little over 8,000 of these jurisdictions. Some are quite small. And so that complicates the task of trying to secure them. And so a couple of things are happening. The states are working now with the local jurisdictions. And many states have been quite aggressive in helping to do assessments of the security. Many have used the handbook that we produced as sort of and we have a tool that goes along with it to help. And that helps identify where are the weaknesses. And then the challenge becomes, all right, can you fix them all? And so I won't name the state, but I had a discussion with the head of elections for a state, and they said, we've completed an assessment of the 60 jurisdictions in our state. The problem is we don't have the money to be able to fix the things that we found. And so, in my view, that's where not a total solution, as Phil said, but a partial solution is the elections toolkit is one that can be used, because now what the Global Cyber Alliance has done is found free tools, and in other cases they've negotiated with companies to say, would you be willing to provide free access to your tool, you normally sell it, to the elections community, and the answer has been yes. And so I think we have an initial set of tools, and that hopefully will expand. But that provides some capabilities that otherwise maybe the local offices may not have had the resources to be able to implement. So I think, and one final thing I would say is, it's been mentioned, but this effort is really complementary to other things that are going on. So there has been an awful lot done in the last 2.5 years across the entire state and local elections community. Some of the things that were mentioned, we in the Center for Internet Security have a small role in a couple of things. We working with the Department of Homeland Security and the elections officials, we have established what is called an Information Sharing and Analysis Center for elections offices. And so we have roughly 2,000 of the 8,000 offices that are now members. That continues to grow every week. And we distribute threat information, we distribute best practices, we provide education, et cetera. We also provide a set of monitors. It was mentioned the term that is called Albert. That's the name of the device. It's an intrusion detection and a net flow analysis. We have now deployed those. Congress has provided the funding, DHS the guidance, across the entirety of the elections top-level infrastructure, so voting registration systems in particular. So we are now monitoring all of the traffic in and out of voter registration systems. There have been, as I said, many of these analyses of the elections infrastructure. There have been exercises, there have been training, and so we are in a far better place than we were, but I think the tools that are being provided in this toolkit add another component in particular for those who either don't have access to, or as I went through the toolkit, I think the videos are actually extraordinarily well done. They're very educational, and they help people. I know when I interface with elections officials, they're not technical at all. I mean, they're elections, they're business people, they're government officials. And so the videos, I think, will be very helpful as they then interact with their teams to say, oh, I saw the video, here are some tools, can we use these tools? If not, what other things are you doing, et cetera. So I think that one, there's a lot of things going on, and I think this toolkit, is another additional and important piece in the total collection of activities.
Thank you. We have probably just a minute for a closing remark from each of you, but I think so. We've heard from John and others, and we're about to see a demonstration of the toolkit. Again, there are jurisdictions both large and small, and capabilities both very strong and very not as sophisticated, that I think can all benefit from the contents of the toolkit and the collection of accessible information that's available there. So, Lisa, any final closing remarks?
So from a macro risk point of view, what's the incredible diversity that both of you mentioned in having a little under 10,000 election organizers, election managers in this country is actually also a defensive mechanism, because that decentralization also decentralizes risk, and you have very little, by design, very little spillover of risk, unlike in a centralized proportional representation, mathematically quite complicated system that most European governments run. What's happened with the introduction of technology is that that risk got re-centralized outside of the government and election organizers' control. And that risk got re-centralized into the vendors, into the technology providers and the developers, which is really an unintended consequence, I believe, of the legislation that came after the Bush v. Gore debate. And which is why these central tools, which are very much a toolbox or a box of chocolate to pick what's relevant to you, are so necessary, because the fact is the risk has gotten re-centralized by using technology.
Sure. So first of all, I am now going to admit that I'm both a nerd and from New Jersey. Thank you, Craig. So I'm going to introduce the first tiny little bit of math to our discussion. What is risk? So risk is the likelihood of an event occurring times the impact if that event occurs. Okay? So when I talk about threat and we talk about risk, you know, threat, if you look at what's really going on, that tells you about the likelihood. Okay? As election officials, you understand the impacts of various different events on different components of your election ecosystem. And so you can then take that likelihood and that impact and determine the risk. And one of the things that as a general rule of cybersecurity is you address the high risks first. And so if, as John said, you've done an analysis, you can't do everything, you use the threats, the threat knowledge, and the impacts and tools from the toolkit or elsewhere to address your highest risk things. And then you've gone a long way to securing our entire election ecosystem.
The theory of learned helplessness is not one that we ought to continue in this space, because I think we've all identified for the past good bit of time that there is much to be done and much that can be done in an accessible way. So please join me in thanking our panelists. We'll I will turn it over to our CTO, Adnan, to demonstrate the toolkit for everyone. Thank you.
Can everyone hear me? All right. So before going into the toolkit, I want to acknowledge the fact that election offices across the nation have been doing a tremendous amount of job on improving their security posture. And Center for Internet Security, the work they have done puts a solid foundation on building those or defining those cyber hygiene practices. Right? As a security community, I think we made it too complicated for everyone on how to secure their systems. Now, when you go out and you talk to a coffee shop owner or someone who is non-technical and you tell them, what do you do for cybersecurity? They're all confused. They all give you different answers, but no one talks about actually washing their hands. So the philosophy behind the cybersecurity toolkit is really the work that had been already done, and to complement that work with tools that enable organizations to operationalize those basic cyber hygiene practices. And the real philosophy behind it is the philosophy I use when I'm trying to get my 6-year-old to do something. Right? And my 6-year-old, and I'm sure it is similar for everybody's kid. He wants to know what needs to be done. He wants to know, more importantly, why he needs to do this. And then he also wants to know how to do it. So as a cybersecurity community, we are doing a very good job on defining what needs to be done. And that's the part that Center for Internet Security has done, the foundational critical controls. Media is doing a decent job on why it has to be done, because accept it, everybody is getting hacked right and left every day. Cybersecurity Toolkit is the how part. So really operationalizing those organizations, operationalizing the tools for those organizations. So we start with a brief video that explains why cybersecurity is important. And we immediately jump them into another short video that explains how to use the toolkit, gives the philosophy, and defines 6, or in this case, 9 toolboxes. And then immediately move them into the toolboxes themselves. As it was mentioned in the first panel, knowing what you have is very important, right? You cannot protect what you don't know that you have. So we start them with enabling them with the tools that allow them to properly inventory their hardware and software. And after getting them to know or getting them to understand what they have in their environment, we move them to a toolbox where we ask them to configure those devices securely. In each toolbox, we will have a small video that explains what this toolbox is about. Again, this is the why part of cybersecurity. And in each toolbox, we provide you with the tools, and we give you that cookbook approach. So in the configure securely toolbox, the work, again, the Center for Internet Security has done for defining the benchmarks that allow you to turn on these small knobs on your computer to make it more secure. So before you connect that device to a network, you want to make sure that that device is securely configured from day one. And after configuring your devices securely, you need to control access to those devices, right? So we provide you with the free tools that allow you to implement network access control, basically defining who can access your network, how they can access it, and within your network, which devices can talk to other devices. And that is, we talk about network segmentation in many cases, but in the toolbox, you are not going to hear these technical terms many times. We try to sort of take the technical jargon away and try to simplify it so that people are not scared of implementing basic cyber hygiene practices. When you're talking to your son, you don't tell them about the shape of bacteria and how they're going. No, you just tell them, wash your hand. This is how you do it. You just keep it simple. After controlling the access, we move them to update your defenses. And this is really probably one of the most important component of the toolkit. Update your defenses is about updating, patching, securely configuring, and also identifying vulnerabilities on your systems and mitigating them. So we have a number of tools that are available. Some require less sophistication than others. But again, we try to give a couple different flavors of each tool so that people can pick and choose what they want to do. The next toolkit and toolbox is beyond simple passwords. And really, this is getting complex passwords, teaching people why it is important to not use the same password across all your accounts on the internet. But more importantly, we want people to move on to two-factor authentication. Two-factor authentication is very important. So we tell them what two-factor authentication is about. We have step-by-step guides, over 100 step-by-step guides on how to enable two-factor authentication on most of the online accounts. But then we also give them a number of different tools that they can install on their mobile devices or on their desktops to manage those second-factor authentication tokens. So after getting them to move beyond the simple passwords, they go into prevent phishing and viruses. And this is exactly what that is. This is antivirus, DNS filtering, and for your browsers, pop-up blockers, right? Because we know that there are a lot of infections going on with those pesky pop-ups that just show up in every browser. So the next they move on to protecting their brand. I mean, trust and brand is very important for every organization who is on the internet, but when it is an election office, it becomes a lot more important, especially during the election times where there's going to be a lot of communication going in and out of these offices. Protecting their brand is very important. So we tell them to move and implement DMARC technology. It's a technology that prevents other people from spoofing your identity on the internet. So not only do we give them a tool that allows them to implement DMARC efficiently, but also we partnered with organizations that offer free version of their solutions to election offices so that they can actually understand the technology that they are using and they can make the most of it. The next toolbox is backup and recover. Backup and recover is making sure that you have offline backups of your systems. Most of the ransomware attacks, really, there is one sure way of recovering from them, and that is having proper offline backups. So we give them free tools that are available to do a full backup of their systems so that in the case of an incident, they can recover from it. And lastly, we move them into log and monitor toolbox. And log and monitor toolbox is collecting all your logs, analyzing them, and making sense of them. As it was mentioned, the Center for Internet Security is providing Albert sensors freely to all voter registration databases in states. And for all the other state and local governments, they can use these Albert sensors, these intrusion detection systems, at a cost recovery model. They are really, the service that they're offering is excellent, and actually it gives them the context of the state and local government threat environment. And McAfee is offering another tool for securing cloud environments. So those tools are also available in log and monitor toolbox. As we mentioned, election offices are doing a lot of things. And when you look at an environment of an election office, they may already be doing some of this stuff. So they don't have to actually go through this entire journey if they have some sophistication level, if they have done some work. They can pick and choose the toolboxes. They can go to the subcategories and say, you know what, this is an area that I have a gap, and this is what I want to implement. So it can offer different sort of sophistication levels to different organizations. The last thing that I want to mention is the feedback mechanism. We did build this toolkit with advice from experts who are doing this on a day-to-day basis, but we want to hear from the users of this toolkit. So we built in a feedback mechanism where users can actually provide feedback. They can rate each tool. So based on that, we can evolve this toolkit into something that is more useful, more applicable to the organizations who are running elections. I only had 4 cups of espresso today, so that's the only reason this was compressed. But this is the toolkit itself. I'm happy to dive into the technical details of the toolkit. I think we're going to be around, and happy to talk to some of you on the technical tools, how they address, what they address. But this is the toolkit.
Before Adnan sits down, any questions for him?
Who actually are the tech people at the state and local level who are the ones who actually use the toolkit? I mean, do they work for the town government or the Secretary of State and state governments? Who actually are the tech people who make these changes?
That's a great question. So, John, do you want me to take that, or do you want? Yeah,
okay.
exactly.
What you'll find is it's different at different levels of government. So at the state level, you'll find that they do have IT organizations. In some cases, the elections IT organization is shared with the rest of the state CIO organization. In some cases, it's separate, but there's a dedicated office. When you get to the local jurisdictions, as Phil mentioned earlier, it's far less certain what you're going to get. In general, you have part-time people, and in most cases, the security is contracted out. And so one of the things that the Center for Internet Security recently published was a guidebook on contracting for security. It was intended for the elections organizations to try to give them, these are the things you ought to be looking at, this is what you ought to put in the contracts, et cetera. So my expectation is that in the local jurisdictions, in many cases, it's going to be contractors that are going to get the tools. They're going to have some technical knowledge, hopefully enough to do a good job, but they're going to be the executors. Thank you.
Any other questions? Well, thank you very much for your time.
Hi, just a real quick one. Have you signed up any local offices to use the toolkit yet, or is this just completely, complete launch, ground zero?
No, we actually launched the beta version of the toolkit at MS-ISAC annual conference at the beginning of May in Denver. And we opened it up to all election ISAC members. And about 60 of the organizations have run through the toolkit and provided feedback. So this is the final version of that initial beta launch.
Thank you.
Thanks, Adnan. I'm going to just close this with one final statement. I think you've heard a lot of good work happening today, and Sean's just covered the awesome effort of the FBI and a bunch of organizations. We know that our state and local elections officials and national election officials have been working on this problem for a long time and working really hard in one of the most difficult environments possible, because you're talking about 8,000 organizations that compose this critical infrastructure, and it clearly is a critical infrastructure, across all 50 states, territories, and tribal governments. They vary from the very large to the very small, and really any one of those environments is going to have multiple systems going from just keeping the voter rolls through communicating to taking and tabulating votes. So it's a super hard problem, as hard as the problem there is in cybersecurity, with a limited number of men and women working on it. With this cybersecurity toolkit, and with the other efforts that we've heard about today, including the CIS efforts and the FBI, there's a lot of great work going on. The real credit goes to those elections officials that are doing this day in and day out. And they need our help. The toolkit, it's a great thing. It's a small thing. It's a great but small thing. It is not going to solve this problem. The only way to solve this problem is a national effort that we all get involved in, and that most importantly, we resource as a nation. And I can't solve that problem, and you can't solve that problem. But there are people who can solve that problem. So thank you all very much, and we'll have a reception next. Great to see you. Glad you could come. Thank you.